Our next session will address issues of the global economy in the context of Iraq and potential conflict. I'm reminded of a column that the New York Times columnist Tom Friedman wrote in 1998 called Turning Turtles, where he said every night the gazelle would go to sleep and realize that the next morning, if he was not the fastest or could not outrun the slowest lion, he would be toast. And each night the lion would go to sleep and realize that if he could not outrun the slowest gazelle, he would be hungry. That was his analogy to describe the intense competition of the global economy. Clearly, as our economy is becoming even more globalized, there is an impact that would be felt, and it is a variable and a dynamic that's very important for us to understand, not only from a strategic perspective, but just from a general understanding. We're very grateful to have two distinguished panelists with us today. Our first panelist, Dr. Phil Bryson, who is no stranger to the Kennedy Center, is the Douglas and Effie Driggs Professor of Economics and Business Management at the Marriott School of Management at Brigham Young University. He has a PhD in economics from The Ohio State University and a BA in economics from the University of Utah. Dr. Bryson is an expert in comparative economic systems, international economics, microeconomics, and his current research focuses on fiscal decentralization in the Czech and Slovak republics, China, the market, and the world market, and the new economy in the United States and Germany. Our second panelist is Mr. Jack Edwards, manager of Gulf United LLC, who holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and a master's degree in engineering administration from the University of Utah. For the last 20 years, he has worked for Saudi Aramco, previously known as Arabian American Oil Company, in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Aramco is one of the largest oil-producing and processing companies in the world and has approximately 65,000 employees worldwide, and is the largest producer and exporter of crude oil in the world, with the number of known oil reserves in the world. In this capacity, he has held several management and technical positions in both the engineering and distribution business lines of the corporation. From having worked, lived with his family, and traveled extensively throughout the Middle East, he's gained a unique perspective on this portion of the world and its political and economic impact on the rest of the world. We're very happy to turn the time over to Dr. Phil Bryson and Mr. Jack Edwards.
It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I think there are a number of people who would like us to question whether we can afford the high cost of a potential war with Iraq. It's sometimes suggested we really can't afford such a war. It's to be welcomed that the world is putting fewer resources into defense and war efforts, but one should be aware that in the Cold War period, the U.S. was putting about 10% of its national output into the defense effort and prodding our NATO allies to share the costs more fairly. Just before the flood, I can't remember which flood, I wrote a PhD and my dissertation was on cost-sharing or burden-sharing efforts in the Atlantic Alliance. At that time, the ratio of defense expenditures to GNP from the years 1954 to 1965, when the Cold War was well underway, the United States averaged in that period 9.54% of its gross national product for defense. Germany, 3.46 of its GNP, the United Kingdom, 6.84, and France, 5.79% of its GNP. In the year 2002, the United States national defense budget was $344 billion. By contrast, 8 or 9 new prospective members of the European Union and this week admitted to NATO, their combined defense budget is, for all those nations, is $3 billion. So our $344 billion is somewhat greater than East Europe is currently spending on defense, but that doesn't include, of course, Russia. The GDP was $10 trillion, $82 billion which gives a defense share of about 2.93% that the United States is spending. So we have gotten out of the defense business. This is after a dramatic decline following the Cold War during the Clinton years, and we enjoyed a peace dividend. And from this perspective, you could say we're still enjoying a pretty good peace dividend because we're spending a lot more of our gross national product on peace goods and other kinds of expenditures. I read recently that our defense expenditures, even though it's declined much as our GDP continues to grow rapidly, that's still a lot of dollars. That's still a big defense budget. And our defense expenditures are 2 or 3 times as much as the next few countries in the list of defense outlays combined. We're spending from a historical perspective only a modest share of our wealth on defense, but because we're wealthy, that's a lot of defense expenditures. In Europe, the members of the European Union are constrained by monetary integration to limit their budget deficits to 3% of GDP and government debt to 60% of GDP. If they raise expenditures significantly above the high levels already required for extensive social expenditure programs, they would have to increase taxes considerably. Germany is currently waiting for European Union sanctions. They were responsible for getting very tight principles involved into the system of the European Union, the monetary system, and they have experienced with the current recession a dramatic decline in tax receipts, which means that in a government that has a lot of spending for the welfare programs they sustain, that they are running large deficits now and will need substantial tax increases, which is not exactly what you need in a time of recession. So there are financial reasons as well as other reasons for which the Germans have declined to participate in the any potential war in Iraq, and one can understand those as well as other reasons, but those reasons do not affect the United States, and it becomes our task, as interpreted by us, to take on the sacrifice of such a war. Well, from a historical perspective, we've been used to that kind of sacrifice from the Cold War period. When considering defense expenditures, we usually worry about the problem of when you get into hostilities, the problem is that you call down unmanageable inflationary pressures, and that for a period of time, as you shift the war from peacetime production to defense production, you still have all the citizens competing for their share of the gross national product, and now the government steps in and wants a big chunk of the gross national product, which means that there are a lot of dollars, and the government can produce all it wants to chase a limited amount of goods, so that at the outset of hostilities you might get inflation. Then after that stimulus is passed, the division between peace and war goods sort of occurs, and then you have remaining just the sacrifice of war itself, which can be very, very great, of course. But in this case, we're in a recession, and a war stimulus is what many people believe that we need. In fact, it used to be the old socialist, liberal, Marxian argument that capitalist economies need war, and I put a slash between all those because all those groups have indicated that to be the case. The socialists, the liberals, the Marxians, that capitalist economies are inherently weak and need war so that they can stimulate aggregate output and keep prosperity going. Well, in this case, those who should be arguing that we need this war are asking, can we afford it? Which is a historic turnabout that's interesting. The actual fact is that the aggregate economy could use it very well right now. The extent to which war preparation would provide general stimulus and be of benefit to the overcoming of the recession is not clear. I haven't got data that would help me to predict what economic growth would occur on the basis of a large war effort or, heaven forbid, a protracted war effort. But our hope is that we certainly don't need that war to get us out of the recession. In fact, in today's Wall Street Journal, there is an article on the second page. I have it over here, but I didn't bring it with me. On the second page that tells about very positive signs that appear now with recent indicators. We've had positive indicators for some time that have given us hope this wouldn't turn out to be a double-dip recession. We would have been through the recession some time ago, in my view, if it hadn't been for the discovery of the corporate corruption among a lot of CEOs and people in corporations covering up efforts in the era of the Clinton corruption. Didn't that sound great? In the era of the euphoria of huge stock market gains. And what happened was that in that era, everybody was cooking the books and generating numbers so that they could keep the investments coming in. We all thought we were getting rich in the stock market. What we were getting was worse and worse financial reports so that we would keep the investments coming in. And having discovered how bad those records were and what distortion there was in corporate reporting for a time, we got into a period where the investor says, we can't believe any numbers and we won't invest. So it was at this point that what should have been a recovery was scuttled and we went into months more of uncertainty. It appears now that the market is gradually healing, and it appears now that the indicators are becoming more positive. Greenspan recently suggested about a week ago that in a year from now the economy should be in good shape. So I don't think we need to think of the United States wanting to conduct war with Iraq to stimulate our economy. And fortunately there are no domestic voices that present that view. But there are foreign people who would believe that, I'm sure, from the old reflexive kinds of thinking of the Cold War. So I believe that right now the big question economically might be what my colleague will tell us next, what Jack has to say about oil. I know that there are a lot of intellectuals, probably more in Germany than about anywhere else, but maybe a lot of other places as well, who share the view that what we really want to do is get into Iraq to secure oil supplies for America. If we had Iraq's oil, we wouldn't need to drill in Alaska, and we could all buy one or two more SUVs, and we could squander oil indefinitely at low prices. This is the view of a lot of people, and there's only partial truth to that. The partial truth being that we do love to squander oil. Maybe I could give a preview by saying that if we go in, there can easily be a price spike with uncertainty, with a temporary disruption of oil supplies associated with that possible, and or even the uncertainty of that might give us a short price spike, as there was at the beginning of Desert Storm, so that for a short time that could be something which could work against an economic recovery, but something which would not scuttle the recovery. So I will at this point conclude by saying that we can afford what would be nice not to have to. It would be nice if Iraq would go along with the UN demands and resolutions and disarm. But if that is not the case, I think there is no overwhelming concern that economic disaster needs to follow. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to be here to talk about a subject that I've lived in and been with and acquired a great amount of experience in the last number of years. As Corey said, my family and I spent about 20 years in Saudi Arabia working for the national oil company there. And when you work in the oil patch, you get to know some of the factors that oil produces for our modern societies. And today I'd like to kind of put in perspective and follow on what Dr. Bryson has said about the unique position of oil. It's both a blessing and a curse in our modern day society. And to go back to put that in perspective for you, let's go back to the day after Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden, where all things were produced spontaneously. But the next day after they left the Garden of Eden, that wasn't the case. And from that time forward, there have been factors that affect, impact, and control the quantity and the quality of our life, of our lives, of the human nature, of the human being. And today, we spend a lot of time worrying about our qualities and quantities of life and the factors that impact that, and oil being one of those. I'd like to take a minute basically, and for the students, the quality of life, the quantity of life becomes a challenge that you're going to be asked to address, accept, and perhaps solve and overcome in the future. The legacy that our generation is leaving for your generation may or may not be perfect, but it has policies and procedures that we have put in place over these last number of years has brought a great prosperity to America, to the Western world, and to great parts of the emerging world have been able to ride on that prosperity. So today I wanted to go back and perhaps put oil in perspective. Throughout time, as man began to develop on the face of the earth, basically land, water, and weather were the controlling factors on the quality and quantity of life. And that went on for eons of time, basically several thousand years, where there was enough land for the flocks and the herds, there was enough land for cultivation, there was enough water, and the weather cooperated. The quality of life and then the quantity of life was pretty well guaranteed. In those years when we had drought, famine, and so on, then of course the quantity of life was curtailed, death was introduced by starvation and disease, and the quality of life deteriorated appreciably. That hasn't changed much, but let's jump forward a couple of thousand years to what I call modern history for the last couple of hundred years. And basically, as we look at the history of the Americas, the development of this part of the world, when we first get into modern history of the Americas, we find out that the indigenous people that lived here in this area basically were hunters or gatherers, fishers, and they lived off the land. They were again subject to the control of the weather, the water, and the land. But with the introduction of the new and the beginning of the industrial age, we began to see that those factors began to change. We needed other aspects, and there were other factors that began to control our lifestyle and our quality of life and our quantity of life. One of those factors that came in and began to replace some of the need for large acreages of land, large quantities of water and the weather was the factor of energy. Energy has been, is, and will be into the future one of the controlling factors of our lifestyles. And when you look at energy, our basic supply of energy today is based on hydrocarbon-based energies, natural gas, crude oil. Those streams produce the lifestyle that we have today. It provides our transportation systems for goods and services and our own personal transportation. As Dr. Bryson said, everybody's got a SUV or two in the garage or maybe a truck. I have one of those that on a good day makes about 15 miles to the gallon. We have larger homes, which we have to heat and cool and light. We basically have requirements for our industrial base. The hydrocarbon building blocks that come out of these hydrocarbon streams provide our lifestyle, our food, our medicine, our clothing. The environment in which we live is impacted by those hydrocarbon building blocks. So we find that one of the key factors of our lifestyle today is the hydrocarbon stream. And as Dr. Bryson said, our economy, the American economy, and basically to some extent, the economies of the development world are dependent on a cheap or economic source of these hydrocarbons. So oil has been ratcheted up in its place in our society. And when we went to the desert in the late 70s, the desert, I refer to that as Saudi Arabia, we had been for years, for decades basically here in the United States, using our own domestically produced oils, and we had squandered those, as Dr. Bryson said. We had America today is the country that uses the largest portion of energy per capita in the world. And we can argue that one way or the other. It's good, it's bad. It produces negative effects on our society. It impacts our environmental conditions. Those are the big arguments that are going on today. It's a delicate balance between the lifestyle that we demand as human beings, and especially citizens of this great country, and the quality of that life that we want to have, a pristine environment, a pristine air quality. We want to have everything basically as good as possible. And we do a lot of struggling and a lot of fighting over the quantities and qualities of life, and oil is one of those factors. I have to continually come back to that theme because it does impact our way of life. Well, the United States today is not crude oil independent. It hasn't been for a number of years. We today will use about 18 to 19 million barrels of crude oil. Approximately 55% of that will come from outside of the United States. It's not a great strategic position to be in this particular world in which we live. It's a non-renewable resource. It cannot be replaced once it's been taken out of the ground and used, and we are finding it more expensive, more difficult to continually supply those streams of hydrocarbons. In the old days in the United States, out in Pennsylvania and Texas, we drilled fairly shallow wells, and the oil basically came up with little effort. It was pumped, some of it flowed freely. Today, we're offshore in 4,000, 4,500 feet of water. We have major technical problems to address. It impacts, of course, the quality and the price of that crude stream, and which in turn impacts our overall economy. If you've ever watched the price of gasoline at the pump, as OPEC, which now controls about 41% of the export crude in the world, but sits on 77% of the known world reserves, if they take a cold, they sneeze once or twice, the price of our gasoline goes up 10, 15, 20, 40, 50 cents at a whack. And so we're finding that we as Americans and our lifestyle are not isolated from the world supply of crude oil. We now find ourselves living in this international world, and we now find ourselves dependent on those streams of oil that come from outside our continental United States. The newspaper just the other day, just yesterday, had an article that about by 2005, 2006, about 66%, or 2 out of every 3 barrels of crude that we'll require for our lifestyle will come from outside the United States. Again, not a great strategic position to be in. As an engineer, when I was in school in the early 70s, when the spigot was first shut off by OPEC, and where oil began to be used as both an economic and political weapon. There was a lot of discussion. How are we going to meet this challenge? How are we going to be able to maintain our lifestyle? How are we going to be able to maintain our safety and our security without those oil supplies? What are we going to do? And there was a lot of discussion on how to address that problem. And since that time, every one of the administrations that this government has had has basically given lip service to providing alternative sources of energy while still pursuing low-cost oil from either within our own boundaries or borders or outside of the country into the major oil supply regions of the world. And we have not spent, I don't think, in my estimation, the time, the energy, and resources to provide alternative sources of energy. The amount of energy that's produced today in this country from nuclear, solar, and wind, which are probably the major three alternative sources of energy, are in single-digit percentages as compared to the demands on our energy resources. So, yeah, we have a few wind farms showing up. We have General Electric producing wind generation, solar generation systems. Nuclear power has peaked and basically is flat and declining in its place in our energy schedules. We have one of the big problems with nuclear power that we here in the state of Utah have to deal with now. And if any of you ever got caught up in Initiative 1 in the past election, you'll find out there's a lot of pros and cons as to whether we ought to be the residual place for all of the waste that comes from the nuclear energy production in this country. Europe is in the same way. France, Germany, parts of England all have fairly large quantities of energy produced by nuclear power plants, and they too have the problem of where they're going to store this nuclear waste that remains hot for eons of time and could have a major impact on the health and the welfare of the country, because we have to store that stuff. One of the terroristic ideas nowadays is to create a dirty bomb, they call it. Basically, it's a standard explosive that disperses some of this radioactive material and can have a major effect on a populated center. Well, let's go back to oil. Oil is found in several places throughout the world. But the major sources of it today are Saudi Arabia, the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has about 26% of the known world reserves of crude oil. Iraq has the second largest known world reserves of crude oil, about 112 billion barrels, with the possibility, with modern technology and further exploration, they could triple that amount of crude oil. Russia is also the third largest reserves of crude oil in the world. And we find that basically those crude oil supplies are in areas of the world which have their own political agendas. The Middle East has affected our way of life, does affect it today, and will continue to affect it, both politically and economically. Greatly so from an economical standpoint because of the supplies of crude that come from the Middle East. I've taken a lot of this information off of a program that MSNBC put out just recently. I've got a lot of slides. I'm going to show you basically where that crude is produced and where it's used. But basically, in the short version of all of this data is that the United States must import approximately 10 to 12 million barrels of crude a day, okay? And a great deal of that comes from the Middle East, Saudi Arabia being one of the bigger suppliers of that crude stream. Western Europe and the Far East, having limited, if any, crude supplies, are dependent also on some of these sources. And it has been for the last number of years that the United States has developed relationships with oil-producing countries, and they have been mutually beneficial to both the supplier and the consumer. It has been recently, in recent times, where oil was used as a political tool. That not so much anymore, because I think we have some cooler heads that are prevailing in some of the countries that produce this raw material that the rest of the world needs. But let me go on to that. In 1960, OPEC was formed with about 3 or 4 original countries, Saudi Arabia being one of those. And over the years between 1960 and today, there have been countries that have come and gone, but there's basically 10 today, 11 if you count Iraq, which doesn't at present time have a allocation under the OPEC cartel. And basically the largest producer in that cartel, OPEC, is Saudi Arabia. They have the largest reserves, as I said, but they also have the largest capability to produce crude and export that. They have an OPEC cap of about 7.34 million barrels per day. They produce probably around 10 to 10.5 million barrels per day. Part of that goes into joint venture operations that they have in 4 places in the world, one of them here in the United States, which oil is supplied to those joint venture companies is up and above their OPEC cap. And then there's also a little cheating that goes on among the OPEC nations. They all have their independent requirements for cash flow, for hard cash, U.S. dollars basically. And so there is, in addition to their official caps, there is also excess crude that is produced and then sold in the marketplace. But by and large, OPEC has been the defining factor in the crude oil supplies and prices throughout the world in the last 30 years. And recently, in the last 10 to 15 years, Saudi Arabia, with its tremendous capacity to produce crude at almost an instant command, Saudi Arabia produces on a regular basis probably about 8.5 to 9 million barrels per day, but they can within 30 days snap that up to about 10.5 to 11 million barrels per day, and can sustain that production rate for considerable periods of time. In Saudi Arabia, the oil minister is a man by the name of Ali Naimi, a young man, a man I got to know very well, worked with, have great respect for, and I think has introduced into the OPEC cartel a balance between production and consumption of this raw material, this commodity. And we find now that there's not so much changes in the prices of crude oil because of some of the philosophies that he's introduced into that organization. It took some discipline. Some years ago, the price of crude was rising. It got up to $32, $34, $35, $38 a barrel, which was having a major impact on the economies of the Western world, the consuming world. Saudi Arabia went ahead and turned on the spigot, flooded the world market with crude, brought the price down to $9.50 a barrel, and introduced some discipline into this organization, which has resulted in stability over time. It was at a time when the United States needed a supply of crude. It stabilized some of our economies, made great contributions to our way of life, so that the relationship between the United States and the OPEC producing countries, but specifically between the United States and Saudi Arabia, have been of mutual benefit to both those countries. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, August the 2nd, the price of crude took a spike, as Dr. Bryson said. When Desert Storm began in January, the price of crude escalated up to about $40 a barrel, and then within days, with a very short period of time, dropped back into the range of about $19 a barrel. Basically, from a lot of the economic studies that OPEC has done, they find that if they can maintain the price of crude between $22 and $28 a barrel, right around $25 a barrel, that it both becomes positive for the producing nations and it is also positive for the consuming nations. It doesn't impact their economy to a great negative extent. But today the United States gets a great deal of their oil from Saudi Arabia, from Canada, from Mexico, from Venezuela, from both. But the majority of our crude comes from OPEC producing countries. Some of it comes from non-OPEC producing countries. But by and large, that oil stream comes from outside the United States. And again, this is a legacy which the younger generation is going to have to address and solve, because it doesn't put us in a great strategic position. Now, that brings up the discussion of war with Iraq. Dr. Bryson has alluded to the two major discussions going on as we pursue this, perhaps this eventuality of war with Iraq again. The one reason for going to war with Iraq, of course, is to increase our security. Since 9/11, the attack on the United States on 9/11, the American people have demanded from their government that government provide a greater, almost perfect security for the homeland. And with the latest events in the Congress of the United States, we're going to have a new Department of Homeland Security. There will be major expenditures that will be needed to bring that department up to snuff. To some degree, we as Americans are demanding that, and we're going to have to stand up to the taxation is going to be necessary, and the expenditure is going to be necessary to provide that degree of security that we are demanding. The other thought of the other war that can be fought with Iraq is basically, as Dr. Bryson alluded to, was to influence or secure that supply of crude. And keeping that supply of crude out of Iraq from outside the OPEC cartel would mitigate the control that the cartel has on the price of crude in the world, and hence its impact on our economies and our way of life. And then, of course, earlier this year, in the spring of this year, President Putin came from Russia to speak with President Bush, and out of that came another slight, if not, could be a major policy shift in where the United States wants to try to get its crude supplies that are necessary. We're beginning to see now development in Russia, export of Russian crude, Repco, which is their Russian export crude, into the United States markets. We also have been lavishing a lot of time and effort on West Africa, Nigeria basically, but there are supplies of crude in that part of the world. We are trying to, if you will, mitigate the dependency that we have had in the last 30 or 40 years on sources of crude from the Middle East, trying to bring some balance into those supplies and demands. If we were to go to war with Iraq and we were successful, and obviously I think that's probably a given, there would be about 5 nations that would be keenly interested in the outcome of that war. Russia, France, Spain, and Italy both have major developments, major contracts with Iraq. Russia has the greatest stake in the Iraqi outcome because they're owed some $8 billion for weapons supplies that were prior to the Gulf War. And since then, they have signed major contracts for the development of some of the major crude oil fields in Iraq. And that they would then have influence over and control of some of the major fields in Iraq. France has the same thing to a lesser degree than Russia. Italy, Spain come up third. The UK has a small stake there. The American companies, of course, have been forbidden by American law to have any economic dealings with Iraq since the Gulf War. They have stood, our major oil companies have stood on the side, and I think with great concern have watched the development of some of these contracts with Iraq. Since 1996, well, let me go back. At the end of the Gulf War, there were sanctions put on Iraq where there was no oil to be sent or sold out of Iraq. Those sanctions were lifted in 1995-96 when the UN Oil for Food program took place. And since then, Iraq has shipped several billion barrels of crude worth about $38.9 billion, which that aid, approximately 72% of those funds, are used for humanitarian aid to Iraq. Those are food, housing, transportation. Just recently, oil field supplies, because one of the reports that was brought to the attention of the United Nations basically said that the infrastructure of the oil industry in Iraq was in such bad situation that they needed to have technology and spare parts to even maintain a production rate of about 2 million barrels per day, which the Western world was exporting under this program. And the surprise is of no surprise is the fact that the United States basically imports about 70% today. In the first 6 months of 2002, the United States imported from Iraq under that UN program about 70% of that crude oil. So it's still, that oil forms a major part of the supply chain for this required commodity. So if we go to war, as Dr. Bryson said, there could be an effect, a short-term effect is what I think, on the supplies of crude. That would depend on whether this war spins out of control and begins to affect the other producers in the Middle East, most notably Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Yemen. All of them produce varying supplies of crude. If the war spun out of control, those supplies were tied up or made unavailable to the major U.S. consumers, it would affect our economy in a big way, because there are no other alternatives that exist. We pump about 5.5 million barrels of crude per day. That pumping rate has been diminishing over time and will continue to diminish because we do not have those reserves anymore. So we are going to be required to go out and try to replace whatever oil that we can't get from the Middle East in the short term. So there will be and can be an impact if the United States goes to war with Iraq. It can be a short-term spike if we are victorious and we're able to basically support a government that would come in and take over control of Iraq. We can be assured then that we would have some influence on the development of the oil fields. It would take billions of dollars of infrastructure to develop those oil fields, make them available to the West, but that could be done, and that supply of crude could be a major factor in the welfare of the United States. You probably wondered why it took so long to get a resolution out of the United Nations concerning Iraq. I'll give you my private opinion. Russia, France, Spain, Italy all had vested interest in that country. And I'm guessing now, I don't know for certain, but I'm guessing that basically that resolution was drafted after there were some assurances that the contracts and the investment that these countries, basically Russia foremost, that their investments would be protected and their position in the Iraqi oil would be protected. So it's just not the United States that's looking for some long-term solutions to this particular problem. It's also Russia, Western Europe, the Far East. All would have some stake in the situation that would come out of the Iraqi war. Let me just wind up my comments and we then can go on with this. But basically, I think one of the things that we have to be aware is that crude oil, hydrocarbon-based streams, has a great effect upon our lifestyle, on the quantity and quality of life. Those streams are not available within our control, so we are going outside to gain those controls. That poses political, military, and security problems throughout the world. We need to be aware of that. The United States needs to shift its policy, in my opinion, to where we begin to develop alternatives, sources of energy, which may never replace entirely hydrocarbon-based streams, but will offload part of the requirements for those external supplies of hydrocarbons. And I'll give you two examples. If we, in 1970, the early 70s, 71, 72, when the oil spigot got turned off the first time, if the United States had gone to a policy of a smaller, lighter weight vehicle, today it would save between a third and a half of the imported oil that we require today would be saved by virtue of that one decision. But we Americans who have a great thirst for freedom, are used to it. The American said, I want the alternative to buy whatever vehicle I want, to have that vehicle have what horsepower I want, to be able to go and come as I want, regardless of the impact it would have on the domestic oil supply. It also would have created a safer interstate highway system, because everybody knows that a heavy vehicle that collides with a light vehicle, the impact on the safety and welfare of those in the light vehicle is tremendously more than it would be of the welfare of and health of those people riding in the heavier vehicle. But I think to suffice to say that we have this problem. We're going to have to deal with this problem in the short term and in the long term, and I think it becomes a great challenge for the younger generation and try to figure out how we can maintain our lifestyle, the energy that it requires, with lowering our dependency on foreign sources of crude. Thank you very much.
In the interest of time, just take a couple of questions. Major Talbot.
My first question is for both of you, and then I have a follow-up question I'd like to ask you, Mr. Edwards. First of all, I read recently that Baghdad had a major trade show just very recently, and whether you're aware of that, I'm not sure, but do you think the impending war in Iraq was the reason for the big show at the trade fair? Were they showing in order to show their support for the Iraqi regime and to prevent the war, or were they hoping to get contracts that might still be good after a regime replacement, so they would be the first ones on the ground in the new Iraq? I mean, I know that's a tough question, but I'd like both of you to address that. And then additionally, I'm also interested in your feelings, Mr. Edwards, on whether or not we should pursue drilling in Alaska in the controversial area that would put the Alaska pipeline back at full production.
I think if you read anything into it, the only thing I would bury in would be a show for stability and viability of the regime. To try to guess that they were trying to get stakes into a post-Saddam regime, I think would be a little bit extravagant.
I just mentioned that because so many did show up and sign future contracts.
I'm sure they didn't publicize it widely if that was the motive.
The oil conference, if I'm not mistaken, took place in April, and there were several hundred firms that showed up at this oil conference. I'll give you my personal opinion on it. I think that Iraq, seeing that the political situations in Iraq and Saddam's dictatorship there were wearing a little bit thin on the world, and especially on the United States particularly, and basically some of the other coalition countries that fought that war during Desert Storm. I think they were trying to double down their bet, is what I call it. They wanted to make sure that the world realized the amount of crude that they had, the opportunities that would be available there with joint venture contracts instead of just production contracts, and the strategic nature of that crude. In other words, placing themselves in a position where you better watch out, because if the consuming world, disrupt the supply of crude, it could have a major effect on us. I think that was one of the reasons that they did this. They did sign contracts and have continued to sign contracts over the last number of months. None of those contracts basically have been activated. Iraq has begun canceling now some of those contracts. The situation has been so unstable in Iraq, as you well know, the last probably 4 to 5 years specifically, that and the oil industry being an industry that requires large upfront capital expenditures before you begin to get your return on investment. A lot of these countries, even Russia, who is put for hard exchange currency, they have not been willing to go in and make those investments. So I think the conference made the world aware of the strategic nature of Iraq as it fits into this overall supply strategy of crude oil to the world.
It should probably be added as well that Iraq is producing only a fraction of its capacity, or what would be its capacity under normal conditions.
It is. Normally they can produce, they've produced over time anywhere between 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. As of last week, reported by the UN, they were producing just a little over, or exporting just a little over 1 million barrels per day. They also produce about between 400 and 500,000 barrels per day of oil that's smuggled out through Syria and Jordan, and then out through Turkey. And they also have a treaty with Jordan, where Jordan, having no oil of it in and of itself, they receive their oil supplies from Turkey. But basically they are producing at substantially less than they could because of the nature of the infrastructure. It has deteriorated so much, and to a great deal in the Western world, in the United States, there is ample supplies of Iraqi crude available to the Western companies, the big U.S. oil companies. But it's difficult to sell that oil in this market right now. I think because of both a strategic question and a political question. We don't want to be seen as using the resources of the enemy, and that speaks to one of the arguments of war for Iraq. Are we really going after their resources, which the United States, by and large, has never fought a war which would give us total control of resources that we wanted. We've always had a secondary nature to that. The Gulf War was fought basically in support of our ally, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. But also, the secondary nature of that war that 329 Americans gave their life for was to maintain that supply of crude out of that area to our economies. So this would be one where we would actually take probably the first step. And the argument can be made, are we after their resources or not? Or are we there to free up, provide a democratic government, and increase the quality of life for those people? That's the question.
Final question?
Mr. Edwards, you've spent 20-some years in Saudi Arabia. You know those leaders intimately. Can you speculate on the fragility of the regime? Can they make it? Or if they cave in and we have breakdown there, what do we find?
That's probably a key question, since Saudi Arabia is our key oil ally. As you're well aware of the history, the Saud family, Abdulaziz Al Saud, established the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the 30s, and has ruled it. He and his family have ruled it basically with an iron hand since then. Now, let me just preface my remarks by saying my family and I live there. We have some of our very best friends, our Saudis, in different capacities, different economic capacities, from the royal family down to the Bedouins on the desert. I have found some of the best people in the world live there. Hospitable, honest, long-suffering, good friends. I've also found some of the turkeys of the world that live there, which is just like any other society, country, or culture in the world. We've traveled throughout the world, 105 countries. I find good people. I find bad people. In this country, it's the same thing. We are not immune. We don't have a corner on good people in this country of the United States. But back to your question. The royal family has, over time, used money to solve a number of their problems. As you are well aware, that the Saud family was supported in his early days by one of the major religious tribes of Saudi Arabia. And they have a great power position in the present government, and they like to hang on to that power position. And so the king walks, I think, a sensitive line between progress and development, and the old school of Islam. Now, terroristic Islam is not part of mainstream Islam. It basically has to do with personal interpretations of the teachings of Islam, just like every other religion in the world. Islam doesn't hold the corner on that particular market. If you watch what's been happening in Europe, for example, over the ages with the religious wars, religions of all kinds and all natures, all 7 major religions of the world have had periods of time when there were minorities within that religion which created chaos and great suffering throughout the world. In Islam and in Saudi Arabia, there are today, and it's a well-known fact since 9/11, but there are groups which look upon the West as a decadent society. In my estimation, they are very jealous of the lifestyle, the power that we have by virtue of our industrial might and our ability to produce and industrial goods and services. I think they're very jealous of that position in the world. And so they want to come at us as from a terroristic standpoint to try to bring down our societies and basically elevate their own societies in relationship. Islam has always looked on the Western world for some hundreds of years that the Western worlds have been constraining or controlling their development. Okay, and it's a difference in philosophy. It's a difference in lifestyle. But to get back to your major question, the king does walk a sensitive line. And I think they've done relatively well in the past. They've been able to use resources to placate some of those questions and problems. But in the last 25 years, Aramco alone sent out probably anywhere from 25 to 35,000 young Saudi men. And they were schooled and educated in the West, basically in Western Europe, a lot of them in the United States. The technical skills and management skills were developed there that we find in Aramco today. When you once open up a mind to a new concept, the old ways slip into the past, and the new ways and the desire for progress and development take center stage. And there is a young, vibrant, fairly wealthy section of society, having been educated that way, that want some of the blessings that we find in the West. And I think that they can get those blessings with different approaches. The radicals believe they can do it through armed struggle or terroristic struggle. The younger people want more representation in their government, which you're finding now. Look at Bahrain. Just last week had their first open election, had women running for office and campaigning for office in an elected, freely elected, group of people that would serve as consultants to the government. Kuwait has that same thing. Saudi Arabia in the last 5 to 8 years has set aside a group of men that consult with the king on policies, internal, external. It is a group of men that are not freely elected. It's appointed by the king. But still, beginning to widen that base of decision-making for these countries. I would hope that the Middle East doesn't fall into civil war, where the frustrations with the slow process of development, as we find in Iran, for example, don't flare up into civil war where we have death and destruction in trying to replace the current regimes that are there now. I'm hoping that through natural course of events and better communication and better ties with the West, that progress in the Middle Eastern kingdoms and countries would not take the route of civil war.
Thank you very much. We will just take 2 minutes to reload our cameras and reset our panel. But I'd like to thank these 2 distinguished panelists for their very interesting comments.